Dr. Sturmberg is a research leader in the Battery Storage and Grid Integration Programme based in Canberra. He holds a PhD from the University of Sydney for his research on nanostructured solar cells, which earned him a scholarship from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. He's a former Myer Innovation Fellow and founder of SunTenants, a social enterprise that makes solar work for rental properties, and spearheaded the Stucco Solar Storage project that transformed an apartment building into a solar and storage-powered microgrid. Regular contributor to energy policy discussions in the public press and industry consultations, and is a passionate open source advocate who has developed multiple software packages that are used internationally, one of which we're about to hear about. Thanks, Bjorn.
Thank you very much. Apologies, I couldn't be there in person. But let me start by acknowledging that I'm dialing in from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, as well as those of the Eora Nation where you guys all are, and all traditional owners of First Nations people of Australia. So this presentation is going to be a quick whirlwind through another open source package, which is called RouteZero, and it is about electric bus energy consumption, as well as the charging of electric buses. So electric buses are not exactly vehicle integrated PV. So what I thought I would do is to really emphasize from this model the importance of integrating vehicle performance with grid modeling. And so RouteZero demonstrates that through integrating a model for electric bus energy consumption with a model for optimized depot charging of a fleet of electric buses. So those are the two components that I'll run through. As a bit of background, RouteZero is a project from some years ago, probably around 2022, we did most of this work. And it was a part of an ARENA-funded project called the Next Generation Electric Bus Depot Project, which was led by Zenobi and Transcript, and revolved around the deployment of 40 electric buses up in Sydney, in Leichhardt, together with the electrification of their bus depot. And that electrification was kind of the real key kind of innovation of that project. And then I should point out that at ANU, I kind of designed this project and the model, but really all of the heavy lifting and all of the genius of it was done by Johannes Hendricks. So like I said, the model is composed of two parts, and importantly, the integration. So a model for bus energy consumption and a model for bus depot charging. It runs as the inputs, you only require publicly available data. So that makes us hopeful that it can be picked up by researchers and industry users such as yourselves. And indeed, it has been used by public transport authorities in Australia and New Zealand, as well as a few industry members. And we've only just recently published a paper on it and made the source code publicly available. So it's available on that GitHub address. And there's also a web app that's been live for a longer period of time, which you can access at the top there. And which, if I was there in person and a little bit braver, I might have run through this all of what I'm about to show you in that live demonstration, but from remote, that's just one too many things to go wrong. So this is an overview of the model. It, like I said, is really unique in that the only inputs that the model requires are publicly available data sets, particularly around bus trips, bus schedules, which we'll get to, together with some weather data as well. So the first part of RouteZero is to calculate what the bus energy consumption is for each route that you may be looking to electrify, and then to collect all of the routes together into the bus schedule, and then to optimize the charging of an given electric bus fleet to service that set of routes on that set schedule. So the reason that we were part of this big project in Sydney was that what we got from that was the data from the fleet of 40 electric buses as they cruised around Sydney. And then from that data, we were able to fit a model for the energy consumption per kilometre based on a range of factors. The 6 kind of key ones are presented here, where none of which are particularly surprising. That energy consumption scales quite intensely with the frequency with which you stop. It obviously consumes more energy to go uphill. The sweet spot of temperature for operation was found to be around 17, 18 degrees, which is interesting as it relates both to the kind of innate performance of batteries, but has a very strong component also on the air conditioning loads of what these buses, how they operate. So if you're at colder temperatures than that, the buses are going to be consuming energy to heat up. And if you're at hotter temperatures, they consume energy to cool down. And that's quite a substantial load here. You'll see that increases or can increase the energy consumption by over 20, almost 30% at the kind of extremer. Then the other one that is interesting to note is that we found that the energy consumption in the bottom right-hand side here, you can see that the starting state of charge of the battery has quite a noticeable effect, and it has this kind of discontinuity in it. So the discontinuity is due to if you start your trip with a very full battery, that limits your ability to perform regenerative braking, and that is seen to have a huge impact. So that kind of increases your energy consumption by 40% if you're unable to do regenerative braking because your battery doesn't have any spare capacity in it. So like I said, this is kind of the only input that you need into RouteZero is what is called a GTFS file, which is a name I've always loved. And then what RouteZero gives you back, and so the GTFS files are the standard used by all of public transport authorities. It's what they publish up to Google. And what you'll find if you can search for a trip in Google or online, it's going to be presented in a GTFS format. So this is a very, very broadly applicable data set and very easily accessible. And then what RouteZero gives you out is the energy consumption of each of the routes as well, which you can see on the map here. One of the, I think, immediately valuable things that RouteZero gives you is that it actually identifies for you which is the most difficult week to service of your bus schedule. So the GTFS files generally run over a year, kind of incorporating all of the different schedules for days of the year and public holidays, et cetera, et cetera. And what RouteZero does is to go through all of those together with weather data and work out what's the week that has the busiest bus schedule, but also where the electric buses will be consuming the most amount of energy. And so in this example, where I've looked at the Belconnen here in the ACT, the most difficult conditions are winter mornings, which, if we think back to, which is due to particularly winter being cold temperatures, and that's influencing the efficiency of the batteries, as we saw on the previous slide. And then the morning time is the most difficult because that is both when it is coldest and then when Canberra has peak hour conditions. So those two factors are identified by RouteZero as meaning that this week, I think it's in June or July, in Canberra is the hardest week to service with electric buses. So this is then the number of buses that are required to service all of the scheduled bus routes during that week. In the top graph shows you the total number of buses required, and then the bottom shows you the energy required for those buses. And if you have a keen eye, you can see that the number of buses is pretty symmetric, has two symmetric peaks per day, kind of the morning peak hour and the afternoon peak hour. But you can see then in the energy consumption that there's quite and quite a difference between those peaks is already visible, that the morning time, when it's colder, requires more energy than the evening time or the afternoon time, even though the number of routes being serviced and the number of buses on the road is pretty equal. The temperature difference drives quite a noticeable difference in energy consumption, energy requirements. Now, in the time remaining, I thought I'd also run through the depot charging optimization part of the model, which may have a bit less relevance to vehicle integrated PV, but is really at the core of so much of what we do in the battery storage and grid integration program, is to see, as the name suggests, how all of these technologies integrate into the grid. And to give a demonstration of that, I've looked at 4 scenarios here, where we look at allowing buses to charge whenever they're at the depot, or restricting their charging times to be any time outside of peak hours or peak grid congestion hours, which are kind of the afternoon, evening. And then the second second criteria is whether or not there is a battery at the depot, as the installation of a battery in the depot in Leichhardt was one of the kind of core parts of the demonstration component of that project. And then those 2 variables, if you take the permutations, you get 4 different scenarios. What I should also point out is that in the back end here, RouteZero is actually optimizing the number of bus chargers required to service the schedule and the bus fleet, and the power rating of those chargers. That's a feature that I am not going to kind of present to here, but it's something to note, and it's kind of quite an interesting part of the co-optimization. So in the first of the 4 scenarios, we have here, we're going to look at allow buses to charge whenever they're at the depot, and we won't have we won't have a battery at the depot. You can see here the format of the results, or the presentation of them, are that in the top graph, you see the number of buses at the depot and the number of buses that are allowed to charge, which is the orange dashed line. And because we're not placing any constraints on when the buses can charge, those lines are overlapping. And then in the bottom graph, you see the power loads of charging these fleet of buses. So there are roughly 80, a bit more than 80 buses required to service the schedule for these 18 routes here in Belconnen. And so you can see that the power requirements, so RouteZero will optimize the charging to minimize the peak load placed on the grid. So you can see that there's a pretty flat, about 3 megawatts of power being pulled throughout the weekdays. And then that just drops at moments where a lot of the buses are out on the road. And then it drops again over the weekend, where there are many fewer scheduled trips. And so you can charge the buses at a much slower pace over the weekend. Then if you introduce a battery into the depot, we can see that the only thing that's changed is in the bottom graph, and the peak power loads, the orange, the load of the bus fleet plus the depot, which is shown in the orange still. That's been brought down a little bit by about a quarter of a megawatt. And you can see that the battery is charging mostly at those moments where the buses are all on the road. And so the demand is becoming really constant across the weekdays. And you can see that the impact on, actually you can see it best on this next plot, which is the same results, but just zooming in on just one day's worth of data, just for Tuesday. And then the top plot here is the power without a battery, and the bottom graph is the scenario where you do have the battery. And you can see that really distinctly here how that battery is now charging during the times where the buses are on the road, and is creating a very flat profile, which is great. It's very efficient loading of the network. but it's not been able to reduce the peak demand on the grid by very much. And that's because the battery is limited in its energy capacity. And so if you spread that energy capacity, which in this example is 4 megawatt hours, if you spread that out basically across the whole day, it has a very modest impact on the peak power. This then is the next set of the final two scenarios, looking at charging, where charging is restricted to not occur during the peak hours of the loading on the rest of the electricity grid. So charging is prohibited between 5 p.m. and 11 p.m. And now you can see that in the top graph, there's no battery in the bottom graph. There is still a battery. And you can see that in comparison to the previous slide, the peak load placed on the grid has gone up significantly from about 3 megawatts to 5 megawatts. Primarily during the middle of the day, we've got to recharge all of your buses that have been out on the morning peak in preparation for both the afternoon peak, that's afternoon kind of peak hour route schedules, but also to get you through the evening when you're not allowed to charge the buses back at the battery, charge the buses back at the depot. So that's a huge increase in the power placed on the distribution network, and something that may very well lead to either new or increased upgrade works that would be required at the point of connection of the bus depot, something for which the bus operator will be liable to at least contribute towards. Then in the bottom plot here, we now have load charging also constrained to not be in the evening, and we have the same 2 megawatts, 4 megawatt hour battery at the depot. And you can see that in this case, the battery is contributing its energy during a much constrained part of the day, just during that middle of the day period. And so it has a much more significant impact in reducing the peak load on the network. The other thing I should point out, just while we're on the fact that the load has been pushed into the middle of the day here, is that we've not modelled any solar being installed on the bus depot. And we've done that because we are looking at the kind of feasibility or the most challenging conditions for a bus fleet, which needs to operate throughout the year under any weather conditions. So there's a great opportunity here to install solar on the depot, which indeed was done in Leichhardt, which will contribute both to financially, but also in terms of the loading on the distribution network during this middle of the day period. Lastly, then, if we combine all of these four scenarios and look at their impact in terms of the local zone substation, that would be where a electrified bus depot in Belconnen were to connect to, we can see here that the black curve is the current loading of that zone substation, and then the introduction of a electrified bus depot adds a very significant load to that depot. And we can see that the impact of the battery, which is comparing the red dashed line and the purple dotted line, is pretty modest. It does a bit during the morning peak, but the bigger difference in those four scenarios is that the increase in peak demand during the middle of the day can comfortably be accommodated by the zone substation, because the load is generally low there throughout the middle of the day, whereas the impact that is had on the contributing charging during the afternoon evening peak, that has a really significant impact, because it either adds a couple, like 3 megawatts of demand onto the zone substation that's already at its limit, or it doesn't add any demand at that period. And what's interesting about why I've kind of presented this is that what those four scenarios in total, or kind of collectively, demonstrate is that there can be a tension between reducing your the grid impact of a bus depot or any other charging between, so let me try that again. There's a tension between impacts at the point of connection of the bus depot, where the absolute peak power that you place on the network is the criteria that's of relevance. And that can be in tension with the impacts on the zone substation, so at a higher aggregate level in the network, where in this case, the higher peak load in the middle of the day isn't an issue, whereas any load at all that's added during the evening is an issue. And the Belconnen zone substation is already actually operating very close to its rated capacity. So there is a real tension there. You really do not want to have any load come onto the zone substation in the evening, but it might be in the bus operator's interests, or they might be more financially penalised for shifting their load to the middle of the day. So that's all I wanted to quickly run through with you today. And yeah, particularly this tension I find very interesting. I think for the context of your meeting, the integration of looking at the energy consumption with how you're going to charge that energy. In the case here, largely they're going to be self-charging, but when they do need to charge from the grid is of relevance. So thank you. And like I said, this model is now publicly available in open source format, and the web app is also still available to use.